Good evening, dear Medyascope viewers. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. This evening, our guest will be Assistant Professor Louis Fishman. He'll be joining us from New York, and we'll be talking about the management of the pandemic in Turkey and the United States. But first, let's take a look at the developments of the week. As of April 23, Turkey's death toll from the coronavirus rose to 2,491. The total number of registered cases rose to 101,790. Here are the developments of the week.
The government has extended the weekend curfew this week in 31 provinces, starting on Thursday, April 23rd, which is a public holiday commemorating the foundation of the parliament. Turkey has imposed curfew until midnight on April 26th. Grocery stores will remain open between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. on April 23rd and 24th. They will be closed on April 25th and April 26th. Other businesses that will be exempt from the curfew are restaurants, businesses that produce medication or hygiene products, health institutions, including veterinary clinics and hospitals, essential public institutions, and some gas stations. In addition, utility companies, water companies, animal shelters, health equipment suppliers, food and cleaning supply manufacturers, transportation companies, hotels, and food packaging suppliers will be operating. Large construction sites where workers sleep overnight, media outlets, production for exports, and produce marketplaces will also be operating. During the week, 1,318 Turkish citizens were transported back to Turkey during travel bans. The citizens had been stranded in Iraq, Germany, Spain, Egypt, and Ireland. The passengers will remain under quarantine in public dormitories for 14 days. Turkey's parliament has suspended sittings for 6 weeks. The parliament is expected to reopen on June 2nd following the Ramadan feast. The suspension comes despite the objection of the main opposition Republican People's Party and People's Democratic Party, which demand greater scrutiny over how the COVID-19 crisis is being handled. The Interior Ministry issued a circular on April 22nd on measures that will be taken against the coronavirus during the fasting month of Ramadan. According to the circular, events and tents where people gather to break their fast, which attract large groups of people, will not be allowed. Visits to holy shrines will also be restricted. Municipalities will increase public transportation at least 3 hours before iftar to ensure that citizens who need to work can be home to break their fasts. The selling of pide, a traditional round and flat bread generally consumed during the fasting month, will be terminated 2 hours before iftar in order to prevent crowds from gathering at bakeries. Ramadan drumming tradition will continue in Istanbul. President Erdogan said Turkey aimed to bring the outbreak to a level that would allow for a normalization of life after Ramadan at the end of May, adding that steps could be taken before that.
This evening, we have Louis Fishman joining us. Louis Fishman is an assistant professor at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. He's also the author of Jews and Palestinians in the Late Ottoman Era, 1908-1914. Mr. Fishman is a regular contributor to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, where he writes on Turkish, Israeli, and Palestinian affairs. He divides his time between New York, Istanbul, and Tel Aviv. And Mr. Fishman is joining us from New York. Hello, Mr. Fishman. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you're joining us from New York, the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States. I'd first like to ask you how you're doing and how the atmosphere in the city is. We've heard in the news, obviously, that there's been tensions between the governor of New York and President Trump. How are things at the moment?
Yeah, I think first of all, when we talk about New York, it really is the epicenter of New York. I mean, of the world of the breakout. If New York had been its own country, we here in New York would have been the highest per million rate. I mean, it's almost 700, 800 per million. I mean, it was substantial. And I think the thing about being in New York during this period is, you know, we were looking all the time. I think, unfortunately, maybe being prejudgmental about Italy and what they were facing. But what we saw in Italy were nightmare scenarios of hospitals collapsing. Thankfully, we didn't come to this in New York City. Meaning New York City, with all its alarms going off, and we'll get to the great tension that exists between Governor Cuomo and also the Mayor de Blasio, between the two actually, and President Trump. But we know early on, and I think it also gave me comfort as the numbers were rising and as there was a greater fear that Italy was just right around the corner, that it wasn't going to be the case, because I think New York, and of course learning from Italy and Spain, prepared themselves and said, you know, we need field hospitals. In the end, very few people had to use these field hospitals, but it was good to know that they were there. Just personally, for the first, I mean, we've been in home now 6 weeks. I think March 12th was the last time we had some normalcy in our lives. I have only left my place 4 or 5 times because it did hit hard. In Brooklyn or in Queens, I'm in Brooklyn and I teach here at Brooklyn College. And unfortunately, we know that it hits, you know, it's an economic disparity. The people, the haves, are better off than the have-nots. So whether it's, you know, Caribbean communities or other immigrant communities, including a large Turkish immigrant population, these communities were hit very hard. So I know from my students, talking to them, it was substantial. You know, you start scratching the surface, and even my students, I had, you know, 5 or 6 sick, 2 or 3 of them I'm still in contact with. It really hits hard. And sadly to say, we also had students that lost, you know, their parents, grandparents, and other relatives. Okay, this is on top of the economic challenge. You know, most Americans in, you know, lower economic levels live paycheck to paycheck, and that includes many people among the what is perceived as the middle class. So I think this also, you could really feel it in New York, that there's a doubling. It's the weight of the virus itself, meaning it was widespread. I can tell you, up until about a week ago, sirens, they were howling all times, day and night. So I live at a sort of an intersection. So we would have sirens 24 hours a day. Thankfully, we see the numbers going down now. It looks like that, as Cuomo says, we reached the apex, and we were having over 800 people, about 800 people dying. And now it's down to about the last 2 days, about around 400 in New York State, with most of those in New York City or right around New York City. So there is a decline, and the good news is we're hearing less sirens. Yes, I heard one a few minutes ago, but it's back to where it used to be, almost, where you hear at an intersection in a big city, you will hear it. You'll hear sirens all the time. So yes, it's turning out better. Let me add, there has been quite a bit of tension between local government, whether that's the New York City government vis-a-vis the New York State government, and the state government vis-a-vis the federal government. And I think that's something that we can focus on more when we talk about Turkey, and understand that you know, the United States, this decentralized system is really good sometimes, but in times of tragedy, it's really added to a greater amount of death. I think there's no doubt about it. I think there's no doubt about that Trump completely mismanaged this on a huge scale. So we have now about over 50,000 people dead. This is the official number. You know, we're going to talk about, I'm sure, with Turkey, about people questioning the official numbers. But I'll tell you, in the United States, they added, you know, 3,000 more people to New York, because they said these people weren't counted, but for sure they're coronavirus patients, and where they had coronavirus, even if they didn't get tested. So definitely we can see that there is this question: is 50,000? Yes, it's representative. We can use it as a benchmarker to understand, but it can be much more. The last thing I'll say about the American crisis, and we're learning much more about it, is how hard it hit nursing homes. And the elderly have been hit really hard in this. Now, when we look at, once again, when we get to Turkey, we'll talk about the fact that there's no real culture of nursing homes. And I think that has caused the number to stay lower. In Italy, we know they have a very high elderly, older citizens, older people, elderly. That's now becoming somewhat of a not a politically correct word, but older citizens. So we'll talk about that. So overall, to sum up the U.S. case, yes, there's a decline. Like Turkey, many places do not have full clampdowns, and we're seeing that some of the states trying to reopen are now dealing with rising numbers also. So the United States it's a mixed bag. New York, no doubt about it, we felt it hard. We learned from California and Washington that this can be contained, and we learned from New York's that it can be contained. It's going to be important to see what happens going forward.
Yeah, so Mr. Fishman, before we speak about perhaps the numbers, I'd like to ask you about the management, let's say, models of both the US and Turkey, which show similarities. As you mentioned, there have been tensions between local authorities and President Trump, and the same has been the case here in Turkey, where there's been some issues and confrontation between opposition party municipalities.
Absolutely.
Yes. So could you perhaps elaborate on this confrontational approaches of both presidents and their unwillingness to take proper measures as advised by medical experts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a great comparison. Very early on in the beginning of the crisis, I had been writing a few tweets about that. Really, well, it's amazing to look at Cuomo and President Trump, and look at Imamoglu, Ekrem Imamoglu, the mayor of, very popular mayor of Istanbul opposition, CHP party opposition, with the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And there's no doubt, I think in the early months, we're talking about not even months here, we're even talking about a month and a half. It seems like it's been months, right? But it's been only about 5 weeks since Turkey first saw its case, first registered case, and we can talk about that later. But the important thing is, I think that this tension was obvious. With Turkey, I think the local governments really had their hands tied, and they weren't able to come out and shine as they wished they could have been because of a clampdown on their charity-based work, for example. They, even before the government comes out in Turkey, come out with collecting money to support people in their city. And this is certainly, I think anyone would find it hard to understand that this wouldn't be their right. And, it could gain points against the government, but also there is this idea that municipalities help their own citizens also, or they have a certain amount of responsibility also. This is just not charity, this is a responsibility to take care of people in your constituency. It's the basic idea of any system. And what do we have municipalities for? I think because the crisis in Turkey, on the other hand, has been overall managed pretty well. I think the government, when I say managed pretty well, I'm talking about the overall consensus that there hasn't been a major breakout like in Italy or New York. So it's one of these things that once the coronavirus hopefully passes, and hopefully passes with minimal death possible in Turkey, and we will of course talk about those numbers, the ones that supported the local governance will continue to support the governance, and that's a very high number, by the way. And the ones that are supporting the AKP party, Erdogan's party, or Erdogan, are going to stay the same. I don't think there's going to be a huge difference. Now, if this would have backfired on the government, and there would have been a lot larger death, because people are questioning numbers in Turkey. But let's say that the numbers are wrong. Let's say that they've been minimalized. Let's say they're collecting data like places in the United States, trying to put other, heart issues that were other complications, other medical complications. It really wasn't corona, it was this. Whatever the case is, even if you times Turkey's by 2 or 3, it would still be better than on many places that we're seeing. So I think in this sense, if it was something that happened in New York, for example, you would know about it because you would hear sirens. You would see your neighbors. You know, I mean, literally, I look from my view, I could see 2 weeks ago, I could see 5 or 6 ambulances on different streets, 5 different streets at the same time. So something like this would be quite obvious. We know that in Turkey, often the government, the main government, likes to minimize catastrophes, earthquakes, starting all the way back to the Soma mine incident, different things like this, right? We know that they like to minimize the bad PR or the lack of bad management of government, because this is in government, all usually the way catastrophes are dealt with, it's upon the government. Okay, and we know that in Turkey that you can't hide this, you can't keep this quiet, meaning the opposition, even with all the limited press freedoms you have in Turkey, and definitely there are limited press freedoms, okay, even with all those, we know that in Turkey continuously voices are raised and people hear these voices, like we do now, by the way. We do now have internal voices in Turkey saying this numbering is not correct. The death toll is much higher.
Yes.
I think people understand that this could be true also. I think people now in Turkey take statistics with a grain of salt at times and say, what I just said about the United States is we can use this as a benchmark. This might not be the exact number, but overall we can say that we have some idea of what is happening. Now let me go and just real fast say that I think perhaps interesting enough, the United States, not like many, Turkey is very statist in the sense that many countries, like I work in Israel, of course, and Israel has 1 or 2 or 3 news channels, and it's centralized. The American case has there's something called local news in America. Every night, every day between 5 and 6, every day between 11 and 11:30. So a lot of people are turning into the local news to get the stories of people dying. And there we get more, detailed information about, this principal from this school, this rabbi from here, this imam from this mosque. We get these stories. And I think because of Turkish press freedoms already being limited, and because the overwhelming pro-government media, for the most part, I think that's safe to say, it is sometimes hard if there's not a major crisis. I'm talking about it like in New York or like in Italy. It's sometimes really hard to pinpoint how serious the crisis is, because we know for one thing is that yes, and the pro-government people, rightly so, have been saying, you know what, our hospitals are prepared, and we know that there hasn't been a collapse in the hospitals. We know that the Başakşehir new hospital just opened, a very impressive hospital that's built by the government. So on the other hand, people know, also from the opposition, they know that the hospitals are not the same thing as they were 20 years ago. And I think that's something important, also among the opposition. And many people, I think, that are usually strong voices against the government, they've quieted their voices down during this crisis and said, you know what, it's not as bad as some of the people are trying to make it, make it be. Because there's a sense rightly so in America also, that, they'll use anything against Trump as they can. In Turkey, they'll use anything against Erdogan as they can. And they'll exaggerate numbers, or they'll make it worse than it really seems. Now, in the New York case, US case, because it's local news, we don't get the news stories of all the nursing homes some people are starting to talk about, and the failure of the government. But that too comes out. So I think it really is a mixed bag, And perhaps if I can just bring this to a second to the issue of the health minister, I think early on the government, and I wrote about this during the first 2 or 3 weeks. I haven't developed this since, but they really came out with a unique strategy. Usually, all major topics of concern to the citizens are dealt with Erdogan directly.
Yes.
Meaning it's Erdogan every day and it's Erdogan only.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, since I think that this could be also with the popularity of the local municipalities. Now, if we're going to say that this is just a big if, perhaps the government said, you know what, let's delegate this work to the Minister of Health and let him, Fahrettin Koca, do this, and let Erdogan stand behind the lines. Something that would have been extremely wise for Trump to have done very early, by the way.
Yes, because
Very
Trump has
early.
been, unfortunately, we've had to see him really go down on certain members of the media, harshly rejecting all types of criticism and directly targeting journalists. And in that
Absolutely.
sense, and in that sense, President Erdogan, yes, has addressed the nation a handful of times in the past month and a half, but it's a significant drops in terms of his usual media presence. And and Fahrettin Koca.
In fact, this reminds me, the press conferences remind me something of what it was like around in 2012, 2013 in Turkey, when Erdogan would hold open press conferences and remove press or get upset with different press vocally in front of cameras, which usually doesn't happen now. So we will have Koca, and I think what he has done, he has been able to really do some good PR for the government, in the sense that, listen, he comes out and he shares in the middle of the night a photograph of Erdogan embracing an older woman. And so we know, there's no doubt he is just not a health minister, but he is a health minister that is highly supportive of the government. I think there's no doubt about that. So he sends out these signals for whatever reason. Okay. But he has given a sense of security to the citizens overall. The fact, the transparency, and we will get the numbers, the question of the numbers, but the transparency of every night giving numbers, and literally just before we logged in here, before we started this talk, I said, let me look at today's numbers. Because we know around 12 or 1 in the afternoon, the numbers come in. And I think for that reason, Koca has been the success. The government has for the first time in years, handled a crisis much better than they've handled any crisis that we've seen in the past couple years, or And I think that is a major turning point. Once again, I don't think in the long run this is going to change this way or this way, who supports or who doesn't support. But it does give a sense of security, whether that security, it's like when I said they opened field hospitals in New York, and I felt a sense of security. I was lacking. I was literally saying, what happens even if I get, if I fall and break my foot on the street, they're not going to be able to take me in the hospital. Here we have something, it's a sense of security of citizens, where they say, you know what, we're getting these numbers every day. They're in contact with us. And that's why when the Interior Minister Soylu came out and declared about 3 weeks ago, I believe, a curfew within 2 hours, that's why it was such a major fiasco. Because what the Interior Minister did was he broke that trust that the government had built with the citizens, that they were going to be open about this. And of course, we know that he resigned 2 or 3 days later, because it wasn't just a fiasco, it was putting, hundreds of thousands of citizens together running. Now, a lot of people said, oh, there were jokes going around. Look at, one person went to get, I think, Prasa, leaks. He was walking out, this young guy walking out with leaks. What is he doing? But you can't do that, because anywhere in the world, you call a curfew, even if it's 48 hours, the internal fear you have is to go out and get anything. And we see in the United States, it was toilet paper. Everyone was running out to get toilet paper. So I think that this sense was the Interior Minister Soylu broke this trust. And yes, he came back, and people speculated, people can speculate all they want. But he came back. I think the idea that he came back also saved the government face because it showed continuity. You don't want to have major internal political fiascos happening during a crisis. So that was controlled very quickly by Erdogan, who said, no, we're not going to let Soylu go. We're going to keep him. And now they're implementing the different curfews, the 2-day, and now a 4-day curfew that started last night until Sunday morning. And let me say that with the major thing that needs to be said, and then we can throw the ball back into your court, is that I think placing the older people under lockdown at 65, this is really serious. People were joking at first, but people under 65 cannot leave their house. I've talked to some people and they're right at that age and they're like, I can't leave my house. There's funny stories of a woman who is 66 and the police come up and ask her, show us your ID. And she goes, well, of course I'm younger than that. Shame on you, things like this. There were funny things happening, but we know that 65 are in the house and people under 20, except for some essential workers, are put in to the home. So we can talk about a Turkish model. That might be a bit extreme, and this is where I can lead some of the more negative side of the things, negative side of the management, because it's been managed well, but not completely well.
Well, you mentioned the 65 and plus year olds being confined to their houses. And as a matter of fact, they have started this application where if they do leave their homes, they receive a text message on their cell phone devices warning them to go back home. So they're really keeping the checks and balances in that regard. But another kind of area which has been problematic is the issue of masks, which we're all forced to wear if we do go out on the streets, but which we are unable to reach.
Absolutely, yes.
So this is one of the issues that hasn't been yet resolved. I mean, on paper, yes, there is a method to go about it, but it doesn't actually translate practically.
Yes, I think there's the issues of the masks. Only 5 masks. You can buy them. Then what do you do? Then people on the flip side, well, in Europe and in America, they don't hand you out masks for free. So we should be thankful for this. Yes, I think if you're working every day, which many people still are working every day, especially the essential workers, I think overall Turkey mirrors the American case and other cases where there is a stay-at-home, sheltered, encouraged. But for example, Florida, it took them very long to do a full lockdown, and Turkey is doing this. I wanted to spend a few seconds and talk about if there is a Turkish model, and I think that if there is a Turkish model, where Turkey has failed is at going back to the publishing of the statistics. On one hand, it's giving security to the overall amount of the population, that there's transparency and stuff like this. But since it's not only been the New York Times, I think there's a tendency in Turkey to say anytime someone like me or other international people, long-term residents of Turkey that aren't Turkish citizens, is that, we're always out to get them, and we're always just this. Well, the truth is that many people, there's plenty of Turkish people, citizens, politicians, that think these numbers are incorrect, especially when it comes to the death numbers. One of the main medical associations also has questioned is that these aren't the correct numbers. And I think that perhaps is where Turkey's failure is. Yes, they managed it in a few ways. We're going to see what's going to happen in the long term of not having a lockdown. But without giving assurances that this indeed are the numbers, then Turkey in itself has undermined itself by not being able to be a model for the world. Meaning, if we knew that, yes, the people that, I think it's clear that there were deaths before March 17th, for example. In the United States, we now find out that a month early February, someone in Santa Clara, California, had died from coronavirus before. We know that Turkey borders Iran and Iraq. We all spoke about this very early on. And even if, what I said was Turkey is, they're early on, they're jumping the hoops they need to jump, but they're not understanding the crisis in its totality. So yes, they closed down air travel. Yes, they closed down borders or partially borders. But by then, I think plenty of people had been infected. If we have very little transparency about where the testing is being done, we have very little transparency of why such a low number in the southeastern areas when it is so close to the Iran-Iraq border. We have also the case that we know that coronavirus was widespread in Greece, not widespread, but pretty evident. They had an issue with Greece, right? People coming back and forth from Greece and Turkey. There's so many people that do this on a daily and weekly basis for numerous reasons, whether business or pleasure or whatever. And we see that Greece's case has turned out much different than Turkey's. I mean, we have to remember that Turkey is number 7 in the world, okay, in coronavirus cases. So there's no doubt that that the greater picture is one of mismanagement, meaning that they didn't do enough early on. And that's where it brings us back to the American case. Because the American case really does, like you said earlier, mirror that, yes, they've done it, but they haven't done it fully. There's not, states implemented stay-home policies, but other states still haven't. South Dakota still hasn't. There's a one meat factory there where about 900 people are coronavirus infected. Okay, so we don't get a sense in Turkey of where this is happening outside the major city centers. And I think so if you go pro-government and you say this is the pro-government, Turkey has been an overall huge success story. Well, that's not really the case, but it has been a much better success story than Italy and the United States. Okay, and I think everything is comparative here. Okay, so if they would be more open and say, it's not really 2,000 deaths, but if we take these numbers and it's actually 5,000, 6,000, okay, then we could say, wait a minute, still there's something to the Turkish model. So we know that Turkey overall has a much younger population. So when you compare it to Italy, it makes sense that many less Turkish people would be infected or would die from it. We know that America has nursing homes. Turkey, like what I started to say at the beginning, was Turkey keeps the elderly at home with them, and only right when they get very sick before death do they end up at a hospital. This is, and I think this is
cultural differences.
Yeah, huge cultural differences. Israel almost doesn't have nursing home culture, but where they do, they have huge breakouts. Okay, so when we start trying to understand models, I think it's going to take us some time to understand, how detrimental was the Swedish model versus other models. But definitely we can question this, and that's where we get in the problem, is that if you do not have a fully open, vibrant society where journalists can write what they think and not be afraid of implications, then we're never going to get the full picture. And that, in a way, if Turkey is a success story, that's a way of disappointment. That, for medically speaking, that we could see that there was a very different case here. And that's where Turkey in itself undermines itself. It's internationally where people say, you know what, there's no free press, there's no this. They just go across the board and say, the normal mantra that people have about Turkey for the last, 4 or 5 years, and they completely write them off. It's like China and it's like Iran, it's no different. Well, it's not really like China, it's not really like Iran, whatever Turkey is. But by not being fully open sometimes, then this undermines them. And I really think that, you know, Turkey has something to offer the world with their hospital systems, with there was one CNN article that was really interesting and said that Turkey is trying not to put people on ventilators. It was the exact same thing that a New York doctor said, that once they get on the ventilators, it's almost hard that they get them off it. And this is one of the methods that they're using in Turkey. Now, Turkey also is using the anti-malaria drug, and there's a lot of controversy over this, if this is working or not. So I think if there had been a more opening up, Turkey could provide very important information in the future. And we're going to have to see how that plays out in the next few weeks.
Well, here's hoping that all the leaders around the world listen to the medical experts in order to kind of have the less possible positive cases and the less possible of deaths. Louis Fishman.
Absolutely, and politicians that listen to the medical experts. And I think in that sense, both Ankara and Mansur Yavaş and İmamoğlu in Istanbul have been critical to keep saying the Turkish saying evde kal, right? Meaning they have from the very beginning have been calling the government for full lockdowns. In retrospect, maybe the government is going to say, you know what, we did it without this. But without that opposing voice, you can be sure that many more people would have been dead today in Turkey. So this tension that we see in the United States and we're seeing in Turkey, in the end, the tension is it's good it's there, and it's good that, you know, I get the government overall. Turkish economy is in a dire situation now. A full lockdown could totally bring the country down. This is the fear, at least. This is the fear, at least. This is the fear for many people in the United States as well. So you get the politicians versus, you know, local leaders that sometimes, you know, they're going to also have to, I mean, both local leaders, let's face it, to be a mayor of any big city in the world today, you don't need to be a mayor of Ankara, Istanbul, but Istanbul, 18 million people. This is going to be a huge challenge for the municipality to pull through it as it is. And I think I would hope that they're able to gain some of their powers back and move forward with this, because it's something very, very necessary. The government also needs them. Let's put it that way. It doesn't go, it's not one-sided. In this sense, in a crisis like this, what we've seen is that they really need each other in this case.
Yes.
And by not working together, this only causes more tragedy in the long run. And that's unfortunate.
Yes, exactly. So hoping we can go beyond politicizing the virus and think about all the citizens equally. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Louis Fishman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much. And hopefully we'll have better days ahead of us, and that this won't last too long, and that we won't see tragedy prolong as long as it has already, and not too much longer. Thanks so much for having me.
Indeed. Thank you again. Sumitar Broka, the Senior Policy Officer for Central Asia and Turkey of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, answered Medyascope correspondent Cansu Şimşek's questions. Broka evaluated the measures taken by the Turkish government and the industries most affected by the pandemic.
We are part of a United Nations country team in each country. Now, at this stage of the epidemic, the focus is necessarily on lives, on saving lives, and on managing the coronavirus epidemic. So the World Health Organization, WHO, necessarily takes the lead in this respect. Now, what we do is we work with our host government, in this case, the government of Turkey, to particularly collect information, analyze information, synthesize it, and we collect information from many countries. We collate it, we make it available to the host government so that they get some idea of what's going on in other countries. And we work with the Turkish government and with other governments to coordinate an international response. Istanbul, as you know, particularly out of all of Turkey, is probably the most exposed because of the volume of tourism that it gets, because of the airport, because millions of people go through it. So, however, it's fair to say that, to be very honest, till early March, we had not really imagined that it would become such a big crisis. That's a fact. There are two main channels. Okay, one is that because of the social isolation and self-distancing measures taken by the government, and the Turkish government is not alone. Every government in this entire in the world is taking very similar actions. The issue is that a lot of people cannot work.
Yes.
And especially poorer people who are doing manual labor, who are doing jobs that bring them into contact with other people. For instance, anybody working in a restaurant, working, in occupations like that, where they can't work anymore, and they've lost their incomes, okay, or at the very least, their incomes have been drastically cut. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is that we were actually worried that supply chains might be affected, but that doesn't seem to be the case so far in any country, okay, that we are aware of. I mean, there's been at most a minor impact. Now, if you take Turkey, for example, one impact has been on the fisheries industry, because a lot of aquaculture products and fish were being exported from Turkey. Okay, now that, yes, that has turned out to be a problem, and exports have shrunk quite drastically. So farm operations are continuing. The flow of farm produce from the rural areas to the urban areas is continuing. And as I said, Turkey has a very productive and varied agriculture. So
Yes.
we don't really feel that there's any major problem so far. If the lockdown measures have to be continued for a long time, then it is possible that that we could run into problems.
Millions of Turkish citizens celebrated the April 23 National Sovereignty and Children's Day from their homes, as limited number of celebrations and events were held this year amid the coronavirus pandemic.
The day, traditionally marked outdoors with children showcasing their dancing skills, reciting poems, and singing songs, is a muted occasion this year. However, all across the country, officials distributed flags to families cooped up in their homes to join the festivities from their balconies. According to authorities, more than 100,000 flags were sent out to families in Istanbul alone. The day also marks the 100th anniversary of Turkish Parliament, and a special centennial session was held, followed by a ceremony held in Anıtkabir, the mausoleum of the Turkish Republic's founder Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, in the capital Ankara. Turkish politicians broke the rules of social distancing during the ceremony, but did, however, wear masks. National Sovereignty and Children's Day is a public holiday in Turkey commemorating the foundation of the Turkish Grand National Assembly on April 23, 1920. The celebrations focus on children after Atatürk dedicated the day to children, seeing them as the nation's future. President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan did not attend the ceremonies. Meanwhile, a report by the Republican People's Party, prepared on the occasion of National Children's Day, indicates that 1 in 3 children in Turkey lives in poverty. According to the report in 2019, the number of children in Turkey between the ages of 15 and 17 who were in the workforce reached 720,000.
Health workers at the Çorum Hitit University, Erol Olçok Training and Research Hospital in central Anatolia, recorded a video of themselves doing the Corona Foot Shake Challenge. This dance became a favorite among health workers worldwide after Dr. Jason Campbell from Ohio shared a video of himself and a coworker doing the routine. Accompanied by Nigerian artist Slim Burna's song O Na Na Na, the challenge involves an intricate series of steps that mimic a handshake.
Vai, esse é o DJ CK, hein? Produzindo mais uma no mundo de Nárnia. Ó, é o bicho, hein? Oh, na, na, na. Oh, na, na, na. Oh, na, na, na. Oh, na, na, na. Oh, remix. Oh, na, na, na. Oh, na, na, na. A maioria das amigas daqui aí.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. See you next Friday at 8 p.m. Good night.